How many of you own a house?
Are you sure about that?
Because it might just be that your house owns itself. And this is just one of the stories that you can learn from reading our tests.
And this shows that the tests, they can tell another story than the domain experts do. And yeah, we'll tell you more about this exciting property that you can see here. We'll tell you more about that one later on.
My name is Anna, and I work as a functional architect. And by the way, does this work?
Yeah, my name is Mats. I work as tech lead.
And we, along with a whole bunch of other people, we create the case management systems for the Norwegian courts.
Which is, as you may imagine, it's a large project. It's been going in production for 16 years. It's mainly a monolith, and we are working on the project along with 35 other people. And it's been development ever since 2000, 2001. So it's been going since then. It's about, don't shoot me for saying this, but it's a Java project.
Sorry.
So it's about 300,000 lines of Java code, and it's even more XML. And it's crucial, as you may imagine, because the entire Norwegian court system depends on our system working.
Yeah, and you can imagine it's complex and it's extensive, but still it doesn't really have very many bugs. And it's been that way ever since the beginning.
Yeah, so when we got into the project some years ago, the project had already been going for quite some years. And as one could expect, there were already established ways of doing things, established guidelines, and so on.
Yeah, and one of the guidelines was that everything that we delivered into production should be tested by someone else. And basically that meant manually tested. Because only through manual testing could we feel safe that the code worked as intended.
Yeah, and as it's a complex system, we had the typical issue that, you change the code a tiny little bit over here, and then it breaks something down here and something up here in completely different parts of the code base.
Yep. And because of this, every third month or so, each and every poor soul in our project spent weeks and weeks doing click, click, click testing through the entire system. We were doing both regression testing as well as testing the new features we delivered for the umpteenth time.
And that was kind of, let's say sad, because
we don't like testing.
So welcome to this testing talk. We don't like testing. No, but what we actually mean is this: we don't like manual verification.
Yeah, because we find manual verification to be really boring, actually. Opening a graphical client and clicking here and writing a number there, it's just really boring. And following a tedious and long test description with detailed steps, the whole idea makes us tired, and doing it makes it even more tiring.
But still, we care about the product we make, so we want to make a system that's great, that's a system without bugs, and a system without those stressful periods right before you have delivery, when you fix one bug and another one comes, and then you fix that one, and then you got it going, like in this guacamole game where you hit one down and the next one pops up. I'm really tired of that.
Yeah, we don't think our users like bugs either. And delivering a product laden with bugs, it's just really no fun. And because bugs in a course management case system could have kind of bad consequences, we really had to take testing seriously somehow.
Yeah, and also, of course, we're determined to create software that makes our users happy, that enables them to do their job without having to have stress and hassle with our software.
Okay, so we as humans, we kind of have a flaw in our DNA when it comes to testing. Because humans are creative and we're flexible and we're full of ideas, but we're really bad at doing the same thing over and over again. And we're even worse at staying focused when we're getting bored.
Luckily, though, the computer is great at these things, doing the same things over and over again, following a detailed description. Those are exactly the things we make computers for in the first place. So let the computer handle the repeating, boring things, so that we can spend more time writing code, doing exploratory testing, talking with users, all those other things we need to do in a successful software project.
Yeah, and we find that most tests can be automated, except for the exploratory testings, which by its very nature is hard to automate. But most other tests can be automated, and we can replace the manual testing.
Yeah. So I started by saying I'm a tech lead. I'm working as a tech lead now, but I'm also a developer, and I've studied computer science, so I learned quite some acronyms. And we developers, we tend to like our acronyms, especially those that sound somewhat funny, like DRY, don't repeat yourself. That's a guideline I learned at school. I guess most developers learn at school. So we have it, when we are writing code, we have it a bit in our fingers that we do it without, we don't repeat ourselves. That's just the way we do it when writing code. So I started thinking, well, don't repeat yourself is a nice guideline when writing code. But what about, why should it be a nice guideline when writing documentation, when setting up development environment, when doing all of these other things, including especially writing tests?
Yeah, because all of this thinking led us into the world of automated tests. Because it turns out that you can actually like tests, even though you don't enjoy manual testing.
Yeah, so let's just take this short turn on why do we even write tests? Well, all these things we already talked about, of course. Those things with catching bugs and avoiding manual labor. But that's just one part of it, because if we take a little bit deeper dive, what is it really all about? It's about trust. It's about building trust.
Yeah, we write tests to make the customer trust us.
And we make tests to make our coworkers trust us.
And we write tests to be able to sleep at night.
And to be able to trust ourselves, and lots of other reasons, which we're coming back to, so stay tuned.
Okay, so since we have different purposes with writing tests, it goes without reason that you can't expect one type of test to fit all your needs. There is no one test to rule them all, sadly.
Yeah, and just because of that, as they serve different purposes, it all boils down to the question of
what story do you want to tell, and to what audience do you want to tell it with your tests?
And because there are many stories in every single domain, there are many stories you can tell about your domain, and there are many potential listeners. And if you're talking to a project manager, or you're talking to a fellow developer, or you're talking to a tester, or a business domain expert, you will use different words, you will talk about different things, all these things when you're talking in person as well, because you're approaching the one you're talking to where they are and what they care about. And the same things go with automated testing as well.
Yeah, so let's start with the bird's view, the value chain test, where you tell the whole story of the domain. So, a quick question, who of you know about value chain tests? Oh, cool, so you're going to learn something now. That's good.
Yeah. So what we mean by value chain test is that you run through an entire workflow, and at the end you verify that the state of the workflow, at the end of the workflow, the state is what you expected it to be.
And for the users, this shows them that you have understood the whole story from A to Z.
Yeah. And at least in our code base, and I guess in many other code bases as well, the production code is scattered somewhere around. So like if you're trying to get a brief overview, like bird's view on what is actually going on here, you wouldn't go to the production code to do that. You would go to these kind of tests.
Yeah. So that means that new project members can go there and find out how the main story of the domain goes and get a quick understanding. So okay, let's show you an example. Not to be too morbid, but we think everyone has probably pondered what happens when you die at one point or another. And luckily, we know the answer, and we have the tests to prove it.
So don't worry, we won't go into details.
Okay, yeah. So maybe we just know what happens when you die in the legal system, but still, it's something.
I guess it's worth mentioning before we're ending on that we're talking about natural deaths, not murder.
Yeah. Okay. So a little bit what happens from a test perspective when a person is registered dead. First of all, we create a case of death. Then we register the deceased. Then we register the heirs. Then we notify the National Registry of the death. And at the end, we assert that the person is registered as dead. And what we show you here is the start of a value chain test for what the courts do with death in Norway.
Yeah, and from a test perspective, even though this may sound a bit simple, it proves two things. First thing is that, well, you can actually run through this code without throwing exceptions or any other technical errors. Just make sure that your code doesn't blow up. And the other thing is that at the end of the test, you know that, okay, the person should now be registered as dead. So you assert on the expected state at the end.
So, what's great is that the customer can feel safe that the case will work as planned. But did you notice another thing? From just a quick glance, you have learned a lot about the flow of a death case. In just a few moments, you have gained more understanding about how the domain works than if you'd spent hours trawling the production code.
Yeah, because if you would dive into one of these methods that we called on here, for instance, register the case of death. Well, the code behind that one is scattered around, and it's old, and it's not very readable.
Nope. And that brings us to another way that value chain tests can improve your systems.
Yeah, and that is, well, we're heading back to the different audiences part, in the sense that, well, these kind of tests, they give us developers, functional architects, everyone on the development side, so much insight into the workflow of the business, so that we actually learn what we're doing, so that we know what we're talking about. But they also do communicate well to the domain expert. So if we were to show the test we just show you to one of our domain experts, she would immediately say, yeah, I can understand this makes sense. Or she would say, no, you have misunderstood it, this is wrong. So it's a quality check, and that, yeah, you have actually understood what you're doing. And it's an assurance to them as well, so that they can trust that, yeah, we know what we're doing.
And it's also a way to make your code more readable, at least when it comes to naming. Because as Mats said, we have a lot of old code here. It's not all very good, unfortunately. And it's a lot easier to create good naming and good code in a brand new test that you create, rather than trying to fix up all your old legacy code. So basically, with very little effort, you've improved the readability of this particular part of the system.
Yeah, and of course you can do this regardless, so to say, about the state of your production code. So you can, even though you don't have good names in your production code, you can have great names in your tests.
By the way, we advise good names all over, but still. So okay, up until now we've only shown you the main part. And the typical thought is that value chain tests are suitable for documenting the happy path scenarios.
Yeah, but we'd argue that, okay, that's great, but that's not all there is to it. There's more to this. They can also be nice to use on your important error paths.
Yeah, because these tests can show and verify the diversity of the domain, and that is equally important.
Yeah, and of course domains may seem simple at first sight, but they never are.
Nope. Okay, so let's show you an example from a whole different context, but still the court systems. This is a case where the court is obliged to let you know something, and they have to make sure you've gotten the notice. For instance, this could be that you've been summoned to a court hearing. So, the court will contact you. They will write a letter to send. They will send the letter by mail. receive answer, and then we can assert that you've actually confirmed to receiving the letter. All very good, right?
Yeah, and this is the happy path scenario. This is the typical things that me and you would do if the court asks us to come, right? We would say, okay, yeah, I received a letter, and then return it immediately. So this is the happy path, most usual case. Oh, by the way, if some of you have been involved in this earlier, it's called förkynning in Norwegian courts. That's what we're talking about.
But the thing is, as you probably already have guessed, this doesn't always happen. And so, if the court doesn't succeed in getting a hold of you, they have to try harder. And that we'll see now.
Yeah, so what happens here is that the court will do several attempts to contact you. So it starts with the same. They write a letter, send the letter by mail, and then, well, you don't answer, so the court will wait for 2 weeks for your answer. And after 2 weeks, they will say that, we didn't get an answer, so then they will send the police to your door to give you the letter in person. And then they know that, yeah, you received this letter. And yeah, if you don't want the court to come to get to you, this is what typically happens.
Yeah. So answer the court when they send you letters, basically. And you might think that this never happens, but if you've been filed bankrupt, for instance, you might not be very eager to show up at that hearing.
Or if you're on the run from the police, or
Yep.
all these things.
Criminals don't usually follow the happy path. Okay, so let's jump to a whole different type of tests. This is a test where you tell about the quirks of your domain. And these types of tests are the ones that you write mainly for your own sanity. So that you'll be able to sleep at night because you know that no one will remove vital code just because they don't understand it. Which can happen often.
Yeah, and here you might typically often ask the question, okay, is this really a quirk or is it data error? Which is an interesting question, but regardless of the answer to that, you must handle the scenarios in your production code when you're building a system.
Yeah, and as you probably all felt yourself, you can't trust anybody or even yourself to model the domain code as it is in real life. There will be mismatches between the code and the reality.
Yeah, so let's jump back to the property we started to talk with, the one that owned itself. And yeah, this property here took down the entire code management system for a day or so.
That was so fun. Not.
Yeah, so like, who would have thought that, okay, a strange house that owns itself could bring down the entire case management system? Well, we didn't imagine that could happen, but it did. And why did it do that? Well, we had some code in our production code that tried to find the owner of a house. So we tried to find the owner of this house, which owns itself. And then we had it go in like recursion forever. And then we ran out of memory and everything crashed. So now we do have some code that checks, okay, does this property own itself? If so, I handle it properly.
Yeah, and here's an example of that test. And this is where your continuously running tests will knock the heck out of any stale documentation that you have. Because there is no better way to document these obscure scenarios than in running tests. Because it screams out to you long before you've even launched the code in production that don't change this unless you really know what you're doing.
Yeah, and this is where, well, if I were to come into this code base now and do some bug fix or refactoring on this code, and I saw that, okay, here we have a check on whether this property owns itself, I would immediately think that, well, this can happen. We don't need this code. This doesn't make sense. Okay, so I can just remove it and go on, right? As a developer that might be too eager to clean up things. I've been there, done that. But if you do that and you do a bit too much refactoring, you immediately notice that, okay, this test is breaking. And then I see that this test is breaking, and it says, well, test obscure scenario that happens in production. Then I think, oops, I can't remove this.
Okay, so here's another example that suddenly occurred to us. Luckily, it didn't break the servers this time, but it turns out that not all houses have an owner.
Yeah, so we do have a test that just tries to synchronize or to find the owners of this specific house in Oslo. And of course, this is pretty vulnerable, because what happens if someone suddenly buys this house? Well, then our test breaks, and then we would have to look into it. But that's a vulnerability you have to account for. But if that happens, we have a look at it, and it's okay. And also, well, if you want to buy this house, who do you want to buy it from?
Okay, so at this point, it's about time that we start talking a little bit about what a domain is.
Yeah, I think we have a question here.
Yeah, doesn't the state own this kind of building in many countries? It does.
Yeah, so the question is whether the state should owns this building. Maybe, maybe not, but typically we would then get an answer that, yeah, the state owns this, like explicitly stating that. So I'm not really sure. But typically we would then get a response that, yeah, it's owned by the state of Norway or municipality of Oslo or whatever, but we didn't in this case. Yeah. Okay, so what is a domain? Yeah. So domain is one of those terms that we typically tend to use a lot without having an exact specific definition that's really good. But we have a useful definition, we think at least. We think it's useful, and that the domain is what the domain expert cares about, what your business experts care about, your business people. And you hopefully know who these are in your business.
Yeah, but have you ever considered your colleagues as domain experts as well?
Yeah, because you may, or not even may, you have at least two domains in your code. You have the business domain. For us, it's the court system. But you also have the technical domain, which is a domain by itself. Because we are used to thinking of the domain as something that the business owns.
Yeah, like Matt said, for us, our domain is the court systems. And if you make a system for a restaurant, then your domain would be the food business or something, and so on. So we all have different domains.
Yeah. However, technology and code and everything that's around it is a domain by and of itself. So everything concerning, well, lots of the things that we've been talking about here at this conference belong to the technical domain. Things like transactions or persistence or databases or all these technical terms, they typically belong to the technical domain. And that's the domain where the developers and the operations folks are the domain experts.
Yeah, and so we can think of the technical domain as what the user doesn't care about. Because as long as the user cares, it's in the business domain, and then you should use the user's natural language, or at least have a very good reason not to use it. In our project, we actually use two different languages for the different domains. We use Norwegian for the business terms, and English for the technical terms. And that kind of makes sense because a lot of the technical literature is in English, while on the business side, all our users speak Norwegian.
Yeah, so you may say, well, but what about those terms that are both technical and business related? And yeah, not everything is either or, and there are some words that are used in both. And there are some edge cases, but in general, we do this division. So we have many method names in our code base that are a mix of English words and Norwegian words. So if you read them out loud, or like the first 100 times you read them, they read quite strange to you. But this is a problem that, well, if you try to divide your technical code from your business-related code, the problem gets smaller.
But still, we work in a legacy system, so. Okay, so here's an example of just such mixed language. And this is always one of the first things that developers notice when they see our code base. And it's easy to laugh about because, yeah, it does look funny.
Yeah, it sure does. But to me, as a developer, I never worked directly for the courts, and I never studied law or anything related. So like I I struggle enough to understand the words in Norwegian if I want to translate everything to English as well. All those. Okay, so what's the difference between this term and this term? Well, I can understand it in Norwegian. How do you translate to English? Well, not exactly, but... And on the other hand, well, if you go to Stack Overflow for something, you do it in English, right? If you Google something, it's in English. If you write a getter, well, you write get, right? Almost by instinct. So those words are in English.
So is it just us, or do any of you guys do this as well? Just us? Really? Cool.
All right, so we're heading on to a whole new set of tests. Now we're going into details. Well, we actually did in the previous one as well, but onto more technical details.
Yeah, and so far all of our test examples have been in a business-oriented language, so that the domain experts, the users, can understand them. But now the technical tests, they should have technical names, because they're in the technical domain.
Yeah, so these tests make your coworkers trust that, yeah, you've done your things right. Or yourself, of course.
Okay, so in the first two tests, your business experts can relax, because they know that you have tests to ensure that you can both search for and register houses.
Yeah, and yeah, this is Java, but because it's like almost everything we're talking about is pretty much the same for all object-oriented languages, at least. Probably functional as well, but we haven't really looked into that. So by that mentioned, the last test here, the test class, matrikel facade test. Well, you notice the word facade, which is not the thing that the users or the business people care about. But that's perfectly fine, because this is for the technical people.
Yeah, and your users don't need to understand that, because they don't need to understand the technical aspects. That's what we're for.
And of course, you can divide into technical test classes and business test classes, regardless of whether it's 1 or 2 or 8 classes in production code. Yeah, so let's have a look at some specific examples of technical tests.
Here are some perfectly legitimate technical tests, and no business domain expert would ever care. Trust me.
Yeah, but your coworkers, your fellow developers would care, and they would also be happy to know that, yeah, we can run our database scripts without trouble.
And speaking of details, there are, of course, details in the business domain as well, of course. And so you have to have tests on that level also in business domain. So let's see some examples. And these kind of tests are of great interest to your domain experts, your users. And of course, they should be in a business-oriented language, so they can understand what you're testing.
Yeah, and if you remember the tests we just showed you from the technical domain, they were in English. These kind of tests, test names are typically in Norwegian, because we have an intention, we aim for our business experts to be able to understand those tests. Yeah, so this is a kind of bold, but not really that bold statement from us, is that tests are as important as production code, and that you should treat them as such. Because it boils down to the question of, well, how do you know that what you made is actually working? And what is it worth if you can't be sure that it's working?
Yeah, and you can think of it this way. The main purpose of production code is to solve problems, whereas the test code has its main purpose of visualizing problems or potential problems.
Yeah, so they serve totally different purposes.
Yeah, and also, how else would you know if there is a self-owning property somewhere that can take down your entire system if you don't have a test that shows it? So, as we've talked about, your tests have more functions than just verifying the code, that the code works the way you think it does. They can and they should be like a Swiss Army knife and serve different purposes.
Yeah, for instance, documentation. We think that tests are one of the best ways to do documentation, as they hardly get stale.
Yeah. And it's also a great way to get a readable story of your domain so you can easily learn about it.
Yeah, and it's also a nice way to learn from your mistakes and to avoid having regressions later on. So that, well, this property that owns itself took down a system once, but it won't do it again.
And not to mention, it's a great way to ensure you don't have those horrible long system test phases with manual testing. Very important. Okay, so how many of you guys have a perfect memory? Surprise! No one, huh?
Well, one thing then that you can be certain about is that the next time you come back to the code you're writing today, you come back to that code in 2 days, 2 weeks, 4 months, whatever, you will have forgotten something about it, forgotten some nuances at least, or even more. Or even worse, if you're not coming back to your code, but your coworker is, well, how should they remember?
Yeah, because someone is coming back to your code, and you don't want to make it a nightmare for whoever it is.
Yeah, and someone may come back to your code after you left, after you switch on to another project or another employer, or like you're not there anymore to tell them what you were thinking, so you need to write it down. And the poor developer that's coming back to your code in 5 years, well, she will be sincerely happy if you provide her with tests that, well, speak the story of your code, like what is it doing and why is it doing it.
Why is important? Okay, so we talked a lot about naming, but what should you think about when you're naming your tests?
Yeah, so let's ask a different question. How do you know that you're missed?
Well, that's really easy to answer, because if your domain expert doesn't understand what the test does, well, it doesn't have the right name, period.
Yeah, so here's a more happy example. One of our tests. And this frist for kunngjøring er 4 uker. Like the deadline for kunngjøring is 4 weeks. And to our domain expert, this is perfectly readable.
Yeah, because if this were wrong, then our domain experts would immediately shout out, no, it's not 4 weeks, it's 5, you dummy. And here's an example that not all test names must be precise, but there should be a statement that your domain expert can approve or disapprove of.
Yeah, so, except for the first part, the properties for, that's my idea. In retrospect, I should have named something else, but yeah. But the rest of it, okay, so we were discussing, okay, we should do something about nums1. How do we implement that? What does that behave like in the real world? And then we talked to the domain expert, and she said, well, they mainly follow the same rules as hovedstadvitne. All right, I thought, I said, sat down, write this test, I said, well, mainly follows the same rule. So I just wrote it down, exactly what she actually said.
And that's just a really good rule of thumb to naming your code. Just write down what your domain expert says, and it's a great starting point.
Yeah, and don't tell lies.
That's not good. Okay, remember this test that we looked at earlier?
Yeah, so when we write this test, we sit down with the domain expert and agree that, 4 weeks, that's correct, right? Everything is good. And suddenly, the law is updated. So now it should be 3 weeks. Okay, what do we do then?
Well, since the test code is equally important to the production code, the obvious answer is that you make sure to update both names. Because tests are only a working documentation so long as you remember to actually update them when the world changes. Because you really don't want your test to tell lies about your domain, because that just opens a whole can of worms.
Yeah, and this is something that the computer cannot do automatically for us. So, sadly or luckily, we must know what we're doing.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where humans actually excel over computers, so it's well worth for us putting a little extra effort into it. So, another way you don't want to lie is by using real mocks.
Yeah, and by this we mean, well, in your unit tests, you should use sensible names for variables. If you're using a date, you should use a sensible date. If you're using sensible if you're using other types, you should use sensible values for that as well. And if you have a mock, you should give it a sensible name as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've seen too many use totally random, meaningless names and types. Because, well, it's just a mock, so it doesn't really matter, right?
Which is unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not really sure. But at least it's not true because, well, we have everyone that's working on the same project hopefully has a mental model of how is the word really, and what should it be like in our code. And we share this model, that we think it should be, we think about it in the same way. And by using just crazy mocks, that it makes this a problem.
Yeah, because these kind of things just spread out, and that means that it's a hinder for training and learning, because it's not really documentation anymore the same way.
Yeah, and it's also very, very nice if when I'm talking to the domain expert, I use the same words as they do. Like if we're talking about Namsman, if I say Namsman and she says Namsman, then we're in the same. Yeah, we don't have to translate between us. And if I also write Namsman down in the code, we can use the same terms all over. Don't have to translate, and that makes everything so much easier. But this, if you are messing up with the names here, well, you're breaking that contract, so to say.
Yeah, and the thing is, rubbish data and names, it just takes a lot of attention, so that the users focus on the errors instead of actually looking at your tests.
Yeah, we already talked about documentation. Okay, so let's look at some of our tests, or like some mocks from one of our tests, which may perfectly fine mean nothing to you. That's okay, you are not our domain experts.
But to our domain experts, AL, JS, and SP, they are different types of lay judges, and they appear in different types of cases.
And some of you may notice, if some of you are really types, the type systems and so on, you may notice that, okay, all of these three are code, just typed as code. And yeah, that's the way a production code is. So the production code could probably be improved, but well, this is how it is.
Still legacy. Okay, here are some examples of how not to do it if you're in the business domain.
Yeah, this is Java terminology, but I guess it should be pretty similar to both C++, C#, and so on. At mock, it's an annotation that says it's a mock, nothing more. But this test luckily is in our technical domain. And yeah, we could discuss whether this naming is good enough for a technical test. In this scenario, we want to test that, okay, how does this code handle different data types? How does this code handle a list or a set or a date or whatever you throw at it? What happens? So in this scenario, we didn't really care about, okay, what is this list? Well, actually, in this setting, I don't really care, it's a list.
Yeah, but look at this test from a business perspective. Because none of these names are plain wrong. They're not meaningful, but they're not wrong, they're not misleading, they're just useless. And so if this were a business test, then it's very easy to write, but it doesn't really give you any insight into how the domain works.
Yeah, so, okay, I guess we're not the first ones saying this, but like whenever you're doing copy-paste, be conscious about it. And by that we mean, well, if you do copy-pasting of your tests, they tend to end up being very general, and very generic, and you lose lots of those benefits that we talked about.
Yeah, because believe it or not, there is a huge difference between a civil case and a criminal case. And a test that is great for one of them won't automatically be correct for the other type.
Yeah. So typing. Well, if you're adding extra types to your code, you can make more explicit models. You can make more explicit production code, which makes some of the error scenarios impossible to get to. For instance, if anyone of you using Haskell, F#, any functional language? A couple of you, yeah. You might recognize the benefits we get by having more types. But like if you have criminal case as one data type and civil case as another one, it will prevent you from doing this copy pasting errors that we just talked about.
Yeah. Another thing that we believe in but haven't really experimented much with yet is mob testing.
Yeah, because when you are using proper good names in your tests, then a whole new world, so to say, of opportunities open up to you.
Yeah, because one of the things we want to experiment more with is involving more people in writing tests. At the moment, it's mostly the developers that are responsible for writing the tests, but we want to involve the business more heavily as well.
Yeah, and one way we want to try that out is by using mob programming test edition. Mob programming is where a lot of people get around the keyboard and program together. And we want to try that with tests where we actively involve our domain experts.
And of course, that only makes sense if the naming is good enough for the business to understand the test. Otherwise, it would just not work at all.
Yeah, and of course this can be useful for the whole team, so that, yeah, we want to involve our business domain experts, but also our test leads, our functional architects, designers, every participant of the team that may not be fluent in programming, we want to involve them as well.
Yeah, and we hope that this can help us do a lot less double testing, because when you mob test, everyone knows what is covered by automatic tests and what is not. So hopefully we won't feel the need to verify the same thing manually.
Yeah.
And then we can have less manual verification, but about the same level of confidence, which would be great.
Yeah, definitely. And also we believe that, well, as I guess most of you know by experience, like, one of the important but hard things in computer science or in software development in general is knowledge sharing. That everyone knows what's going on, what are we doing, how are we doing it, and like if we are working one team and you are working another team, how do we share the knowledge we gain? And we believe that, well, by using mob testing, we share the knowledge. We share the knowledge more.
Yeah, we also think it can be a way of catching bugs before they even happen, just because more people look at and evaluate the code when writing the tests.
Yeah, so you can kind of say that it's continuous code review. So I guess it's worth stating out here that we haven't really, this is on our wish list of things we want to do more of. We have just briefly tried it. Experiences so far are good, but we'll see where we get.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're going to try to summarize. I can just say first that we will be around for the rest of the conference. Hopefully we'll have some time afterwards for questions and comments as well. But we will be here for the rest of the conference, so just approach us for those questions that might be out there. But, okay, to summarize, long story short, take your domain with you into your tests.
Yeah, and your tests can help you get better naming and better code, even though you have old legacy code in the bottom.
Yeah, and we would say that you should acknowledge that the technical domain is a domain by and of itself and should be treated as such.
Also, tests provide a different kind of value than production code, but they're equally important.
And we also do believe that tests, they are the best, most effective way to document your domain.
And last but not least, the most important thing of all. Go home, make sure you actually own your own house, because it might just be that your house owns itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we have time for some questions. Go. Yeah.
Have you tried Ward Cunningham's fit or Bob Martin's fitness to engage your domain experts in writing and specifying test cases?
No, we haven't tried neither fit or fitness.
So it's a kind of table-based test that you can specify. So Fitness is based on a wiki map, but Fit itself originates from writing HTML with Word, where you specify tables about scenarios, or let's say input values and results like you had in your scenarios, for example, and that's because it's Word or let's say Wikibab, it's very easy to engage non-technical users. It doesn't mean that they are on their own running these tests, because you have to have the scaffolding to glue the system together, but that's something that's been around for about 20 years or so. And it's underappreciated in my opinion.
Another thing that we haven't tried, but that's also on our list and probably underappreciated, is Cucumber, but it's kind of similar.
Yeah.
So just to go on from that, so you're working with non-programmers and they're looking at Java code, I guess. Like, how is that working out for you? Like, do they understand Java well enough? Have you had any issues with getting them to be able to read code and work with you on that?
Well, yeah, we have some issues. We have some issues in the sense that, well, we typically sit with them and tell them what the code does. Like, that's the level that we're at the moment.
And also we actually end up with a different problem, because some of our domain experts are really smart, and they start to think about how we should solve the problems we have, talking about databases and code and stuff, when really what we want them to think about is business problems. So it's give and take.
Yeah, this may be an even bigger issue if you have like technical domain experts. So if you're working on more technical domain than the course, you might, yeah, your business experts may want to be experts in code as well.
I really like the suggestion about mob testing. One thing I have experienced before is that if you do include the unhappy path, it still tends to be a very happy, unhappy path. More or less one that your code is ready to deal with. In addition to mob testing, have you thought about any other ways to stream that fabulous diversity that human input brings to an application to your testing?
Well, one related thing we've done a little bit is not actually sitting down and writing tests together, but involving more people in the team, like test leads and functional architects and stuff, in planning what tests to write. So that we don't go as deep as actually in writing the test ourselves, but planning out, and that helps.
Yeah. Anything to add to that? But we're really open to more ideas, like from you on the frontier. It's a great idea. Thank you very much.